Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be talking about how to plant up some planters ready for summertime. Now though I'll be focusing on summer bedding in this video, you can also use the same kind of rules I'm going to be talking about in this video for winter bedding and autumn and spring bedding as well. And I will go over the slight different characteristics of each. So this is the planter I'll be doing here. It's this big whiskey barrel at the back. It's about 150 litres, so it is quite a large planter to plant up. I'm also going to be potting up these 4 pots on the left hand side as well. These are just going to be slightly smaller spots that I'm going to be dotting around the front of my garden. And what I've currently got in the back planter here, it's a bit of my old winter display. Now last year I didn't go overboard with flowers or anything for my winter display. You can see all I've done is I've got some cineraria at the back just to have a bit of height and some nice silvery foliage over the winter, and then I had a dwarf Fargesia bamboo at the front just so there's some greenery over the winter time. So this was really a foliar display last year, but you can have lots of nice flowers over the winter depending on your climate. Here in North Scotland I tend to use pansies and violas because they can flower over winter. Quite often I use ornamental kale. Ornamental kale holds its colour really nice over winter, and it has the added benefit of having flowers in the spring. In fact, just behind me, I'll pan around and you'll be able to see them here in my front garden. So you can see on the left hand side here, all those yellow flowers are actually from the ornamental kale. They were nice compact plants over the summer. They've shot up and they now give me a good display over the springtime. Something similar to them is the wallflowers. That's another good bedding plant you can grow. They will just give you a bit of greenery over the winter, but come springtime they give you a fantastic display. So anyway, in this video what I'll be using for planting up is 2 Inseti Morellii, which are these ones here. These are some really nice interesting foliage plants. No flowers, but they do well in a bedding scheme over summer because the leaves look really nice. The leaves on these young ones haven't got the full colour yet, but once we get stronger sunshine they'll develop, and they'll look small when I first plant them in spring, but by the end of summer they'll be absolutely huge plants. They really do grow quickly. Also got a Snetty here in the middle. This is more of a spring flowering plant, but I'm just going to use it as a good example of a spring plant you can use for your bedding. And then I've got lobelia down the bottom, and then the individual pots are just going to be planted up with these tubers on the right, which is tuberous begonias, and in the bottom I've got a couple of gloxinia tubers as well, which I'll be planting up in some of the pots. So to begin with, what I'll do is I'll take out my existing winter display. So what I tend to do, because I like to reuse my bamboo every year, is I don't actually plant the bamboo in the soil. I just keep the bamboo in its original plastic pot. I just place it into the planter. That way when it comes to remove it in springtime, I can easily take it out, keep it in its plastic pot all summer long, and then put it back in autumn time. And it's kind of like a reusable foliage. I'll just quickly show you my other planter as well. And so with this one on this side, it's the same size barrel. All I've done differently is the cineraria was a lot shorter here and the bamboo was a lot taller, so I just put the bamboo at the back, the cineraria at the front, and given a bit of a foliage display. It does look quite messy now. It's gone through a harsh winter, so it all needs to come out and be replaced with nice summer bedding plants. I'll also show you some pictures quickly of how this looked in previous years when I planted up with summer bedding, and you can see what it looks like with the boughs then. So I'll now take this bamboo out so you can see what it looks like in its pot. Some of the roots will have come out the bottom of the pot. What it does is it roots through the bottom of the pot and can get the extra water it needs by that method. But what I'll do is I'll pull it out the planter, I'll cut off any of the roots that come out the bottom, and then I'll just grow it over the summer in its normal pot, ready for going back in next autumn. So that's my planter cleared, and now is a good time for me to talk about compost choice and also planter size. So when it comes to the planter, the bigger display you want, the bigger the planter, the better effect you'll get. When you have bigger planters, you can do several tiers of different plants. If you just have a small pot, you're really just going to have 1 or 2 types of plant in it. A large planter like this, you can tier it up with different levels, so you can have a real kind of 3D height to it and get a really good, interesting display. Also, the bigger the pot, the less you have to worry about watering. One of the big problems with summer planters, especially if you're using hanging baskets, is the plants are so big and hungry over the summer. They're really thirsty. You need to be watering them daily. So the bigger your planter, the less you have to worry about watering. Now when it comes to soil, what you want to make sure is you have a really good compost that absorbs a lot of water, a really rich compost so it has a lot of feed in it. Most multi-purpose compost should be fine. If you are using a hanging basket, look for the ones with extra water retention, because they will hold a lot more water than your normal compost. But don't use those ones with extra water retention in a large planter with poor drainage, because what can happen is it gets a bit too wet and the roots can actually rot off with those kind of composts. But certainly for smaller planters and hanging baskets, try and find ones that have the extra water retention, or you can also use water retention granules and put them in the compost as well, but I just prefer to use straight up compost. Now for these really big planters, what I tend to do, because compost is quite expensive, I actually use a lot of my garden soil. So I use 50-50 garden soil and compost. I mix it in, and then I just do a top dressing of pure compost on the top, just as a weed suppressant. And what happens every year, especially if you have an old planter that you've been growing plants in for a few years and it has mainly just compost in it and not any soil, is because compost is an organic matter, it slowly degrades over time and breaks down, so you'll notice the soil level will actually slowly drop. So what I do is I just add a bit more compost in every year just to refresh it and bring the soil level up. What I also do, because this is a used pot and all the nutrients will have been used up from last year's display and the winter display, is I will dig in quite a lot of slow release fertilizer to make sure I've got some feed throughout the summer, and then I'll do supplemental feeding from midsummer onwards to keep the display going the whole summer long. So when it comes to summer bedding, the reason I like it so much is you get such fantastic flowering for so long. So although it's a lot more effort than using perennial plants usually just flower once in a season and then they're kind of finished. You do get some perennial plants that can flower the whole summer long, but the displays are never normally as good as an annual plant that is for bedding. So the reason for that is the bedding plants, all they want to do is flower like crazy, set seed and then finish. So they will grow really quickly, flower the whole summer long, but they'll be short-lived, but that's not a problem when you're just growing them for the summer. But because they are such fast-growing plants and they are normally tropicals as well, you need to wait until the right time of year to plant them. It needs to be just after the last frosts are finished, when you've got guaranteed warm weather, because frost will kill most of the bedding plants. And you want to make sure that you give it plenty of feed, because they are such fast-growing plants and they flower so much throughout the summer. They need a lot of feed to keep that flowering display going. So what I'm going to do with this one, because it's an old pot, is I'm going to dig in some new fresh compost. I'm also going to check for any vine weevil larvae. Vine weevil can cause a lot of damage to your bedding plants, especially in tubs. They're not really such an issue in the ground, but vine weevil in a planter, the little grubs, I'll show you one if I find one, they eat all the roots off and they can really weaken your plants. So first of all, I'm just going to sprinkle on some slow release fertilizer, add a bit of compost, mix it all in, get the level just about right. So that's my soil prepared. Fortunately there wasn't any vine weevil larvae this time, but I have seen some in the rest of my planters. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to do a layered effect. So it's only going to have 2 levels. A planter this size you could probably get away with 3 levels. And what I'm talking about with layered effects is to make the best kind of display, what you really want is a specimen plant in the middle, or if your planter's against a wall at the back. And that's going to be a really tall, probably a quite expensive plant as well, and that's going to be the main interest. What you want is a plant that's high up and doesn't have any growth lower down, so you can plant underneath it. So a lot of these plants they're called standards, which is a bit confusing because you think standard would just be like a normal plant. A standard in a horticultural sense, when it comes to amenity horticulture, is a plant which has a long clear stem at the base and then all the growth at the top. So quite often if you've got a really big planter you could use something like a standard rose, or I quite like using standard leucanthemums because they really give a nice display the whole summer long. I'll show you some photos of previous planters where I've used them and then planted up the base. So you want to have your main central kind of specimen plant. What I'll be using for these pots of mine is I'm going to be using my Seti Morellii. So I'm just going to put this in the center because this plant does get quite large, and if it's too close to the wall it's going to be right up against my window. So when it comes to the bedding and planting out, it might look quite bare when you first plant it up, but bear in mind these plants do grow very quickly. It's over the summertime as well, and they're going to be growing the whole summer long, so 3 or 4 months, maybe 5 or 6 if you're in a warmer climate, and they're going to get to 5-10 times even more the original size that they are when you first plant them. So make sure you do give them enough space that they can fill out and grow. Now if you want an instant impact, then plant them densely if you want to, but just bear in mind they will become quite congested and they're going to fill out anyway, so you can save a lot of money in planting less plants on knowledge that they will grow out. So here we go, we have the specimen plant in the middle, and then what I'll be doing is I'll be having just one layer. But what you could do is if this was a standard plant and it had a much longer clear section before it had any growth, then what you could do is have a ring around it of medium-sized plants. For example, I'm going to be using trailing lobelia around the outside of my pot, but I could get bush lobelia which grows straight upright, and they could be in a ring around the plant in the middle, and then around the outside we could have a second ring of the trailing lobelia here, and these would all trail down the edge of the pot, and so you get that kind of nice mounded effect. And that leads into the next thing I'm going to talk about, is the types of bedding. So with a lot of bedding plants, they're either trailing or they're not trailing, and it doesn't matter the type of the plant, because lobelia, for example, and petunias and a few other plants, you might think, oh, they're really good for trailing, but they come in two different types. So this is a trailing lobelia, but you can also get bush lobelia. Same with petunias, you can get trailing petunias, you can get bush petunias. So just make sure you check the label if you've got a trailing plant or not. So what you would do is put a bush variety in the middle in a ring, and then put a trailing variety on the outside, and that will trail down, it will cover the planter, and at the end of the summer you won't even be able to see the planter. It will just be completely covered in flowers. It'll look like you have a ball of plants. It'll look really nice. So with this planter, because the morellii grows quite so big and it can be a bit shady, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put trailing lobelia around the outside. But as I say, if I had a standard, I would definitely put some more plants in here, maybe some bush plants, and make sure that it's really covered and looks like a nice display. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set out my lobelia. You don't want to plant any of your plants straight away, you just want to place them on the surface so you have a rough idea of where the things are, and then you can move things around, tweak them, get everything into the correct positions before you then start to plant them up. So if you are planting up your bedding plants and they come in packs like this, there's a couple of different ways to get them out. If you've got them in the polystyrene packs, which used to be really common but a little bit less common nowadays, if you look underneath, there will be a circle a bit like this here, and there's some weaker polystyrene at that point. You can just push your thumb through there, you'll break the polystyrene, and the plant will come out very easily. With these, it's not too dissimilar, but the plastic doesn't break. You just push slightly on the very base there, and you'll see it pops up, it loosens, and then you can just easily pull it out like so. If it is a bit stuck, you might want to squeeze the sides a little bit first and then push it, but it should again loosen and then pull out really quite nice and easy. So when it comes to laying out the plants, you can either have them in a ring like I've done here, or what you can do is you can stagger them. When they're staggered, that gives you a couple of advantages. One is you can cover a bigger area with less plants, and the other reason is it actually gives them a little bit more space for each plant as well. As you can see here, this plant here is quite close to these ones here, but if I just stagger it slightly, it'll give it a lot more space around it. So you can see there, by staggering it, that gives us a bit more space. That will mean that this will fill up the planter more evenly. So if you're wanting to fill up a whole planter evenly with one type of plant, this is probably how you do it. If you just wanted to have a ring of plants around the outside and a second ring in the middle, then you would just have them in a ring formation or on a straight line. But most planters are round, so you tend to do things in rings. So that's how you would do it. With this one, I'm going to do very slightly staggered, but not very. The reason being, I want the lobelia to trail down the edge. And also, as I said before, this morellii does get very large and by the end of the summer, and there won't be space for it to grow in the middle. So that's roughly the positioning I'm going to go with for my plants. I do sometimes tweak it slightly as I'm planting them because they do look a little bit different in the ground as opposed to when they're standing upright, especially as some of them are falling down to the side, so it's kind of hard to see exactly their final position. And when it comes to planting up bedding plants, if it's a large planter like this, it doesn't really matter if it's an odd or even number, but I tend to find that if you've got a circular planter, odd numbers look a lot better than even numbers because you can kind of make triangles or hexagons, so it kind of looks, or multiples of 3, it kind of gives more of a rounded a shape to it. If you have a square planter, even numbers tend to work better because you kind of work in multiples of 4 with the 4 corners. So odd numbers look slightly better with round planters, and even numbers of plants look slightly better with square planters. I have actually got 10 here, so it's an even number, but it is a multiple of 5, which is an odd number, and it's a larger planter. So it's now time to plant these up. I'll start with the insetti in the middle. What you will notice is as I dig a hole for it to go in, you will see that the compost level will raise slightly as I'm adding that extra compost in from what's already in the pot. And when it comes to planting up bedding plants, you just want to plant them the same depth that they were in their original pots, and just give them a very gentle firming in as well. So what I'll do is I'll show you 2 methods. So this is how I normally plant my plants in a planter. I just kind of make a hollow round about where I want them to be. I check the height. I continue digging until I get the height that I need, making sure it's the same height as the original height that was in the pot. I then carefully take it out of the pot. You don't need to loosen the roots or anything because these are very fast growing plants. They're not trees with woody roots. They've actually got very succulent roots, so You don't need to break the roots apart, the roots will naturally grow out of the compost. If you were planting a rose or a woodier shrub, then you would want to loosen the roots, and then place it back in, check the compost levels about right, and then fill it in with soil. Just very gently firming it down so it's stable, doesn't get blown around by the wind, but I don't want to really compact it hard, otherwise we're going to damage the roots and the soil will get a lot of compaction, and the compaction will slow down the growth of the plant. So that's one way of doing it. The other way you can do it, which is quite useful if you've got very tight space, and that's using the original pot. So I'll take the soil back to the condition it was before. You then want to figure out your position as previously, but the next thing to do is take it out of the pot, place the plant to the side, and then what you want to do is actually bury your pot exactly where you want it. So fill the pot with some soil, as that will be the soil that you'll be going into. Create a hollow for your pot. Put your pot at the same level as the soil. Then fill in around the pot with some of the excess compost and soil and firm it down just a little bit more firmly than you would if you're just planting the plant, just to make sure it holds the shape nicely. Then get the pot, give it a little twist side to side, pull it out. You've then got a perfect planting hole. All you need to do then is pop your plant in, a little bit more firming down, and it's planted. And then you've probably got a bit of extra compost, so you just need to scatter that around and just fill that in with the rest of the pot. So I don't tend to use that method as much, but if I've got a very tight space and it's difficult to get to work around, then that's sometimes an easier method of planting it up. So I'll just notice I put this a little bit too far forward, so I'm just going to reposition this further back, and then I'm going to go ahead and plant up all the lobelia plants. So that's it all now planted up. As I say, it looks very sparse now, but by the end of summer this will look quite nice and completely filled with flowers, and it won't look sparse at all. But as I say, if you want to have an instant impact a bit earlier on, by all means go ahead and plant it up with a much higher density of planting. So something else I like to do next with my plants is to take off any flowers. Now with the lobelia, they're so small, there's not many flowers at all, so I don't always bother with lobelia because the flowers are quite small. It doesn't take a lot of energy out of the plant to produce the flowers. But if I was doing something like these African marigolds here, the flowers are very large. It puts a lot of energy into those flowers, and that really stunts the growth for a few weeks. So what I do, especially with these smaller plants, because the amount of leaves compared with the flowers is quite small, if this was a larger plant, the ratio of leaves to flowers wouldn't be such a great thing, and it wouldn't slow it down as much, putting its energy into the flowers. So with this, I just get some secateurs and I just cut off any flower buds which are starting to form. What that will do is the plant will then put all its energy that it's getting into roots and do shoots, and it will size up much faster than if I left the flowers. If I left the flowers, it would still grow roots and shoots, but over 50% of its energy will actually be going into the flowers. So you'll end up with a much smaller plant. So doing this, you'll end up with bigger plants overall, and by the end of summer you'll get a much bigger display. So now I'd like to show the planting up of a smaller pot. So what I'll be doing with this is I'll be using tubers instead of actual bedding plants. Now when it comes to planting out your plants, as I say, always make sure it's past the frost date. If you're using tubers though, and they don't have any kind of top growth on them, which they shouldn't, mine do because they've been left for too long and they should have been planted a few weeks ago, you can actually plant them just before the last frost. The reason being they'll be underground and they should be fine and protected from any frosts, but as long as you don't have any hard frost, because hard frost will still damage them. Now this is quite a small plot compared with the other planters, so I'm not going to put any garden soil in. This is just going to be pure compost. And when it comes to buying new compost, what you want to make sure is that it's nice and loose. Most compost is shipped on pallets, and those pallets have a huge amount of compost stacked up in individual bags, and often the bags at the bottom get crushed and really compacted by the other bags on top of them. So when you get your compost, it can come out a bit like a brick. What I can do is throw the bag on the floor a few times, or you can punch the bag, kick the bag, or sit on it. There's a few different ways you can do it, but generally you want to loosen up the compost before you open the bag, and then when you open it you might find some hard lumps. Make sure you loosen that as well, otherwise the plants will really struggle to grow through the rock hard compost. So here's an example. You can see I've got some compost here. It's quite a hard lump that I found in the bag of compost, even though I've already loosened it up from the outside. So what I'm going to do is you're just going to break it apart in my hand like this, and that will just loosen it up nicely. And as I'm pouring in this compost into the pot, any lumps I find, I'm just going to break them up, make sure it's all nice and loose and the roots can easily spread throughout the whole pot. So with this one, because it's fresh compost and the compost already has plenty of feed added to it, I'm not going to add any extra slow release feed. But if you don't have a lot of feed added to your compost, you can always add some slow release feed. But what I tend to do is, if it's a fresh compost mix, I just liquid feed it later on in the summer, as normally the first month or two, it's fine, you don't need to add any extra feed. So what I've done here, because I've got tubers, it's actually easier just to place the tubers on top of the compost and then add more compost. So these are begonia tubers. You plant them very shallow. Unfortunately, this one has already started to grow, as you can probably see there. So with the begonia tubers, they don't need to be too deep. I can just nestle them on the surface and then cover them with compost. It's just a bit easier than digging holes and planting them individually. If you're filling up a planter anyway with compost, you might as well just not fill it as full. Place your tubers on the top and then cover them up. So with these begonia tubers, they're pretty big. I probably only need 2 or 3 in a pot this size. Because it's a round pot, I'll just have to lay out 2 and 1 and 3 to show you the differences. So first of all, with 1, you just put it in the middle. That would grow up and fill the pot. With 2, it would look a little bit strange, quite congested in the middle, a bit bare either side. But then with 3, you've got a much better even spacing. So I'm going to go with 3 with this one. I'm going to go with equal sized ones as well. These tubers are probably a little bit big for this pot, but it just means they'll be a fuller effect quicker, and it might get a little bit congested at the end of summer. But with bedding plants, it's not too big an issue if they're a bit congested. It just means your money's not going as far for the amount of plants that you've bought. And when it comes to the tubers, each tuber is different as to how you plant it up, different depths. But if you're doing bedding begonias, for example, you only want them about 1 inch under the surface. They're quite shallow planted tubers. And to see what side to plant, you tend to have a hairier side where all the roots are, and then you've got a top side where the shoots are. Most times there's a slight hollow in the top side where the shoots come from, so that hollow side you want on the top. But that's not always the case, so that's not the best rule to go by. So you can see with this one, for example, this one, there's a lump at the top. The hollow area looks more like it's on the bottom, but you see there's no shoots there. The shoots are at the top, so it's not always the best way of telling. Generally, as a general rule though, the hollow is where the shoots come out from. But if you can, have a look for any eyes which are developing, and if you can't see any eyes, then you can often see there's more roots on the bottom than there is on the top. Unfortunately, you also get roots on the top of begonia tubers, so it can be a little bit tricky to tell which is the top. So I'm just going to go ahead now and cover this with soil. So once you've got your plants planted up, what you want to make sure you do is give them a really good soak. That helps the compost get washed around the roots and make sure that they're nice and damp and they're not going to dry out. Because they've still got their roots in a very small area inside that original compost that they came with, they can dry out very quickly at this stage. So make sure they're really well watered for the first couple of weeks. And once the roots get into the compost, it'll be a little bit easier to look after them and water them. But with all planters in the summer, with hot weather, you often do need to water them once a day at least, and hanging baskets can be 2 or 3 times a day, depending on the size of the hanging basket and the size of the plant and the type of compost you use. And as for aftercare, make sure you give this a weekly feed of tomato feed throughout the summer. If you've got slow release fertilizer, or if you've got compost with lots of slow release fertilizer in it, the first month or 2 you shouldn't need to really feed them. If you are finding your plants are a bit slow to get going, a bit weak, you can give them a feed that is high in nitrogen at the beginning of summer, which will encourage much faster growth on your plants. But if you do that in the middle of summer, you'll get a lot of leaves and you won't get many flowers. So it's generally tomato feed you want to give them, unless they're looking weak and they're taking a long time to get established. So that's all for this video. What I'm going to do now is continue with my other planter, get that planted up, plant up my remaining pots, and start my summer bedding collection. You will see these planters again finished in a second video I'm going to be making, where I'm going to be talking about summer bedding plants, but I'm going to be focusing more about the ones in the ground and different types of bedding, whereas this video is more focused on the aspects of bedding plants and floor displays when you're putting them in planters.